Have you ever found yourself staring at the same four walls that once echoed with laughter, and suddenly realized you can't remember the last time someone said your name out loud? That silence you hear? It's not just quiet. It's heavy. It's the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a weighted blanket, not warm but suffocating, not because sound has disappeared, but because presence has. If that question stopped you, even for just a second, then I want to gently invite you to stay. Because this video wasn't created to entertain. It was made for hearts like yours, hearts that have known love, loss, and the kind of loneliness that doesn't need words to be understood. I still remember a moment from years ago, during a volunteer wellness check at a senior home. I met a former piano teacher, 86, brilliant, and utterly alone. She'd wake up each day, sit by the window, and wait. Not for her children, not for a student, just someone, anyone. When asked why she didn't reach out to her family, she smiled and said, "They already gave me their best years. I don't want to ask for more." That smile? It was full of grace. But behind it, there was a quiet ache, one I've seen reflected in the eyes of countless elders over the past 10 years. Because the truth is, you can be surrounded by people for decades and still find yourself invisible when you need them most. But what if I told you that being left alone isn't the end of the story? What if I told you that this chapter, this quiet, uncertain, solitary part of your life, could become the most powerful one yet? As someone who's spent a decade walking alongside older adults through the most vulnerable seasons of their lives, I've come to believe that solitude, when approached with intention, can become sacred. It can be where we meet ourselves again, after years of caring for others, giving, sacrificing, and holding everything together. The question isn't whether we'll be alone at some point. It's what we'll do with the time we're given. That brings me to the story I want to share with you today. The story of Jack Thompson. Jack is 62 years old, a retired accountant, a father, a husband who loved his wife Sarah with all his heart until the day she passed. Like many of us, he looked forward to retirement, slow mornings, warm coffee, grandkids in the backyard, a quiet kind of peace. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Sarah's passing left him with an emptiness he wasn't prepared for. His children, now grown and busy with families of their own, slowly began to drift further from the center of his life. The phone rang less. The house grew quieter. And one day, Jack realized something devastating. The world hadn't stopped, but it had moved on without him. Now, before we go any further, I want to pause here, right in this moment, and ask something of you. If any part of what I just shared feels familiar, if you've ever sat in your kitchen and wondered how a place once filled with life could feel so hollow, if you've ever felt the ache of being remembered only occasionally, please do this, like this video. Subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below that simply says, "I'm still here." Because I want to see you. I want others to see you. And I want this space to be one where we remind each other, you matter. Not just in memory, but right now, in this moment. Jack's story doesn't end in silence, and neither does yours. What he did next is something I've seen echoed in the lives of many resilient, remarkable seniors. He took back his story. He made a choice to stop merely surviving and start rebuilding his identity, his health, and his connection to the world around him. What followed was not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet, powerful one. The kind that happens when you finally stop waiting for someone to knock on the door and open it yourself. In this video, we're going to walk with Jack. We'll witness his heartbreak and healing. We'll see the power of simple choices, a morning walk, a shared meal, a brave conversation. And through his journey, I'll share with you the insights I've gathered through years of practice, the patterns of loneliness, the science behind senior well-being, and the steps anyone can take, even starting today, to create a life of meaning, connection, and peace in older age. If you've ever wondered whether the best parts of your life are behind you, I promise you, Jack's story will make you think again. Because there is power in stillness. There is strength in quiet. And there is purpose in every breath you take, no matter your age, your losses, or how invisible the world may try to make you feel. This isn't a video about growing old. It's a video about coming home to yourself. So take a deep breath. Settle in. You've already taken the first step by being here. And now, let's begin, just like Jack did, in a quiet house, with an aching heart, and a single decision that would change everything. 1. When retirement arrives. But peace doesn't follow. They don't warn you about the silence. You prepare for retirement your whole life, financial plans, Medicare, home repairs, maybe even a hobby or two. But no one tells you how to prepare for the sound of your own footsteps echoing in a hallway that used to be filled with voices. No one tells you what to do when the phone stops ringing, when the calendar is suddenly blank, when the pace of life slows down, but your mind is still racing. That was the part Jack Thompson wasn't ready for. After more than 30 years working as an accountant, Jack finally retired. He'd done everything right, built savings, paid off the house, even set aside a little fund to travel with his wife Sarah once they had more time together. But time, as life often teaches us, is never promised. Sarah passed away just 2 years before Jack's last day on the job. A quiet illness that came too fast and left too soon. And so when Jack packed up his office and turned in his badge, he didn't walk into a chapter of freedom and leisure. He walked into a house that felt colder than it used to. Emptier. Too still. At first, Jack tried to stick to his schedule. He got up at 6:30 every morning, just like he used to. Made coffee. Read the paper. Took a walk around the neighborhood. But each routine began to feel like a shadow of the life he once had, a life that used to involve other people. He tried watching TV in the afternoons, but the noise only made the silence afterward feel sharper. Meals were quiet. Days were long. And nights? Nights were the hardest. That was when the weight of Sarah's absence curled up beside him, like a ghost in the dark. I've worked with seniors for over a decade, and this is something I see again and again. Retirement is often imagined as a reward, but without purpose, structure, or connection, it can feel like a slow unraveling. Research shows that within the first year of retirement, many seniors experience a significant drop in social engagement and mental stimulation. But it's not the stats that stick with me, it's the stories. It's men like Jack, who stare at their dinner table and realize they can't remember the last time someone sat across from them. Jack's children, Adam and Emily, called occasionally. They were loving kids, raised right, busy with careers and families of their own. They tried to check in, but time zones, school runs, and Zoom meetings always seemed to get in the way. And Jack? He never wanted to be a burden. So he said the same thing every time. I'm fine, don't worry about me. But he wasn't fine. Not really. One afternoon, Jack stood by the window, sipping lukewarm coffee as the sun dipped behind the trees. He'd just gotten off the phone with Adam, who'd called to say he couldn't make their usual Tuesday visit. Some urgent work stuff, Dad. I'll come by later this week. Okay. Jack said it was fine, that he understood, but when he hung up, he didn't move. He just stood there. Still. Silent. And in that moment, he felt it. Not sadness. Not even anger. Just hollow. That's the part most people don't talk about, the hollowing. It doesn't come all at once. It creeps in. A missed call. An empty mailbox. A calendar with more white space than plans. It's not dramatic, which makes it harder to explain. But it's real, and for many older adults, it's the beginning of something dangerous, emotional disconnection. That evening, Jack heated up leftover soup and turned on the news, hoping for a distraction. But the stories of chaos and conflict only made him feel further from the world. He turned the volume down and just sat there, watching images flash by, not really seeing them. His spoon clinked against the bowl. The clock ticked. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. But inside, nothing moved. Nothing changed. In moments like these, the question isn't, what do I do tomorrow? It's who even notices if I do anything at all? And that's when the loneliness really begins, not as a feeling, but as a question. A quiet, persistent question that echoes louder than any sound in the house. Now if you're still watching and still reading, then I want you to do something brave. In the comments below, type, I understand, if you've ever felt the stillness that Jack felt. Because your story matters. You're not alone in feeling it, and the more we say it out loud, the less ashamed we feel for going through it. What Jack didn't realize in that moment was that his loneliness wasn't unique. It was human, and it didn't make him weak, it made him real. But the danger of that kind of isolation is that if left unchecked, it can turn into despair. That's why this moment in Jack's life matters. Because what he chose to do next, though small at first, became the beginning of something bigger. And that's where we'll go next. Because the loneliness didn't go away overnight. It lingered. It grew. But eventually, it pushed Jack to his first quiet act of defiance, a walk outside his routine. A walk that would lead to conversations, new faces, and perhaps most surprisingly, a second chance at connection. Let's follow him there. 2. A question that hits harder than silence. What if one day, you're truly all alone? You can get used to silence. That's the terrifying part. At first, it startles you. It makes the walls feel like they're closing in. But over time, the stillness stops screaming and starts whispering. It becomes familiar, expected, until someone breaks through it, not with noise, but with a question so honest, So direct, it cracks open the calm you've built just to survive. That's what happened to Jack on a chilly Thursday afternoon when his neighbor Walter stepped into his kitchen and asked a question that would echo louder than anything he'd heard in months. Walter wasn't a close friend, just a familiar presence, retired, like Jack, and living 2 doors down. They shared brief chats over fences, traded weather updates and gardening tips. Both had lost their wives. Both had grown children who rarely called. Both were learning to navigate this strange chapter called After Everything. But that day felt different. Jack made coffee for 2 and they sat in the sunroom, watching dry leaves spin across the backyard. Conversation started light. Walter mentioned how the birds were nesting early this year. Jack nodded. They talked about arthritis, the price of groceries, and an old neighbor who had finally moved into assisted living. Then, after a long pause, Walter looked around Jack's empty kitchen, then met his eyes and said quietly, "So, it's just you here now?" Jack didn't speak. He just nodded. Walter stared at his coffee for a moment, then said, almost too softly, "Same for me. My son's in another state. My daughter works all the time. Some days I talk more to my dog than to people." There was no bitterness in his voice, just an emptiness too familiar to disguise. Then came the sentence Jack would replay again and again in his mind. What if one day you're truly all alone? He didn't say it like a warning. He said it like a fact. And somehow that made it worse. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the question wasn't just Walter's. It was his own, the one he had buried under routines and distractions. The one he pushed away every time he said, "I'm fine," to his kids on the phone. The one that crept in during commercials and lingered in the quiet hours before sleep. What if no one came? What if his name faded from memory? What if the world kept spinning and simply forgot he was here? As someone who's spent more than a decade working in elder care, I've seen this moment more times than I can count. It's not always spoken aloud, but it's there, in the eyes of the man sitting alone in the waiting room, in the voice of the woman who says, "Don't trouble my daughter, she's busy." It's the moment when the realization hits. Loneliness isn't temporary anymore. It's becoming your reality. That evening, Jack wandered his own house like a stranger. He touched the photo of his late wife on the mantel, ran his fingers over the edge of the kitchen table where his children once sat for homework. He turned on the television, then muted it. The noise no longer helped. The silence underneath had grown louder. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He was just unsure. Unsure of what his days were adding up to. Unsure of whether this was simply life now, quiet, invisible, paused. But somewhere inside that discomfort was a flicker of awareness. And awareness, I've learned, is often the first step toward change. That night, as Jack lay in bed with Walter's words looping through his mind, something shifted. It wasn't a grand decision. It wasn't a plan. It was a recognition. A realization that if nothing changed, nothing would change. That the slow fade into isolation wouldn't stop on its own. And that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to vanish quietly. The next morning, Jack woke up with a strange sense of alertness. He made his bed. He shaved. He opened the curtains a little wider. The world hadn't changed, but he had taken a small step toward meeting it again. He wrote a short list. Groceries, call the pharmacy, walk to the park. Simple things. But for Jack, they weren't chores, they were lifelines. Proof that he still existed. That he could act, not just observe. And it all began with one question from someone who understood. That's why I believe everyone needs a Walter. Someone who doesn't just ask how you're doing, but dares to ask what happens if you keep pretending you're fine. Someone who sees through the polite nods and shallow conversations and reminds you that your life still deserves attention, even now, even after. And if you haven't had that person in your life, let me be that voice for you today. What if one day, you're truly all alone? Not to scare you, but to invite you to choose differently before that day ever comes. Because just like Jack, you have time. And what he did next, though simple, marked the start of something that changed the shape of his days. He began to reclaim his story, not with big moves, but with quiet decisions. The kind that remind you, you still have agency, you still matter, and connection is always worth the risk. What happened next? That's where Jack's journey really begins. Because sometimes, the smallest acts, saying yes to a neighbor, joining a group, stepping outside your front door, can be the things that lead us back to life. And Jack, quietly and deliberately, chose to come back. Let's walk beside him. 3. The first step out of isolation, reclaiming life, one small choice at a time. No one ever applauds the first step. No one throws a parade when you get out of bed and decide to do anything differently. But sometimes, the most powerful moments in our lives happen without witnesses. Quiet, undramatic, personal. And often, they begin with a decision so small it almost feels invisible, until everything changes because of it. For Jack, that moment came one Tuesday morning. He had woken up as usual, early, restless, with no real plans ahead. The coffee brewed. The news played in the background, more noise than information. The sun peeked through half-closed blinds. Another day, identical to the one before. But this time, something felt different. Not better. Not easier. Just different enough to make him pause. Walter's words from the week before still echoed in his mind. What if one day you're truly all alone? It hadn't left him. If anything, it had burrowed deeper into his thinking, his choices, the way he saw the quiet around him. And now, it sat beside him like a challenge. What are you going to do about it? Jack looked down at his half-filled coffee mug and realized he didn't want to spend another day just passing time. He wanted to feel something again. Anything. So, he made a decision. He got dressed, not just sweatpants and a t-shirt, but real clothes. A collared shirt, a belt. He shaved. He combed his hair. These may seem like nothing to most people, but for someone who's been drifting in the fog of isolation, these are acts of self-respect. Signals to the brain that say, I still care. I still matter. Then, for the first time in months, Jack stepped outside with intention. He didn't go far, just a walk around the block. But with every step, he started to notice things he'd stopped paying attention to. The rhythm of his feet on the pavement, the warmth of the sun on his neck, the scent of a neighbor's garden. These were small things, but they were real, and most importantly, they were his. In a world that had felt increasingly out of reach, this was his way of touching back. And that walk? It became a habit. Not because someone told him to, not because it was scheduled, but because it felt like reclaiming a piece of life. And each day, he walked a little farther. Some mornings, he waved at a passing neighbor. One day, he stopped to chat. Another day, he joined a group of retirees playing chess at the local community center. He didn't say much at first, just watched. But eventually, someone asked him to play. And for the first time in what felt like years, he laughed out loud. What I've learned over a decade working with seniors is that loneliness doesn't vanish in one big moment. It fades in layers, through repetition, through effort, through small victories that slowly rebuild a sense of belonging. Jack wasn't trying to reinvent himself. He wasn't chasing happiness. He was simply saying, I'm not ready to disappear. The science backs it up. Studies show that even light physical activity combined with moderate social engagement can dramatically reduce symptoms of depression and cognitive decline in older adults. But beyond the data, I've seen the transformation up close, when someone goes from existing to living again. And it often starts just like this, with one walk, one conversation, one brave step out of the house. Jack began to add more to his days. He picked up a book he'd been meaning to read. He cooked something from scratch instead of heating leftovers. He even called his daughter, not because he needed anything, but just to say hello. And you know what happened? She called back more often. Sometimes, when we initiate, even gently, we remind others that we're still here, that we still need connection, even if we don't say it out loud. But none of this happened overnight. There were still hard days, quiet nights, moments of doubt. That's the truth about rebuilding a life after loss and isolation. It's not a straight path. It's a spiral. You circle back, revisit the pain, re-encounter the fear. But if you keep moving, you build momentum. You heal, not because you forget what you've lost, but because you choose to keep living alongside it. And Jack, he kept choosing. He chose to show up to the community center more often. He chose to respond when someone invited him to dinner. He even began volunteering at the local library, one afternoon a week, helping organize shelves, chatting with visitors, feeling useful again. Not just present, but purposeful. If you're still with me now, I want to invite you to do something simple but meaningful. Write in the comments, I choose life. Not because everything is easy, but because the choice itself is powerful. Let it be your reminder, just like it became Jack's, that the smallest action can reclaim the biggest part of you. So where does this all lead? Well, Jack's decision to reconnect with the world didn't just bring him new routines. It brought him someone entirely unexpected. A woman with a spirit that matched his calm. A presence that filled the room without saying much. And just like that, what began as a walk around the block led to a new chapter neither of them had planned for. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about what it means to open your heart again. after loss, after silence, after believing your best years were behind you. Because what came next for Jack wasn't just healing. It was love. 4. When you least expect it, a new companion, a new kind of light. Most people think that love, connection, or even deep companionship has an age limit. Like there's a cutoff somewhere in your 50s where your heart just folds itself away quietly and decides its work is done. But the truth is, connection isn't a chapter. It's a human need. And sometimes, the most meaningful bonds form not in youth, but in the stillness of later life, when you're ready to see someone not through the eyes of longing, but of understanding. Jack had never imagined meeting someone new. After Sarah passed, he had quietly placed that part of himself in storage, like an old photo album, precious, untouchable, and not to be reopened. But healing has a way of creeping in through the cracks, and for Jack, it began the day he walked into the local community center and met Evelyn. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. She was simply present, sitting by the window, knitting a bright yellow scarf. Her eyes calm, posture relaxed, like she wasn't trying to be anywhere else. That alone caught Jack off guard. He had gotten so used to people rushing, multitasking, checking phones while pretending to listen. But Evelyn, she noticed things. She saw him. Their first conversation wasn't remarkable, just a shared complaint about the coffee being too weak. A chuckle, a smile. But sometimes, that's all it takes, a single, authentic moment to shift something inside you. They started running into each other more often. At book club, during afternoon walking groups. At first, Jack told himself it was coincidence. But when he caught himself straightening his collar before leaving the house, he realized, maybe it wasn't. Maybe part of him was starting to hope again, not for romance, necessarily, but for something warm, familiar, real. Evelyn, as it turned out, had been widowed for over 10 years. Her children lived far away. She had learned to live alone, not bitterly, but with grace. She filled her days with gardening, community service, and journaling. But like Jack, she knew that even a full schedule couldn't fill a quiet house at night. That companionship isn't about constant conversation. It's about shared presence. As they spent more time together, something began to change. It wasn't grand or dramatic. But slowly, Jack noticed that his afternoons weren't something he had to get through anymore. He began to look forward to them. Their conversations stretched longer. Their silences grew more comfortable. There was no pressure to perform, to impress. Just the ease of being with someone who understood the shape of loss and still chose to love life anyway. I've worked with hundreds of older adults over the years, and I can tell you, this kind of connection is rare. Not because it's hard to find, but because many people stop believing they deserve it. They tell themselves it's too late, that their heart is too old, too broken, too tired. But that simply isn't true. Neuroscience tells us that the human brain and emotional centers remain deeply responsive to connection well into our 80s and beyond. What changes isn't our ability to feel, it's our permission to seek joy again. Jack and Evelyn never labeled what they were. They didn't need to. They shared small routines, grocery trips, walks in the park, quiet dinners with jazz in the background. Sometimes, Evelyn would bring over soup. Sometimes, Jack would fix something around her porch. It wasn't flashy, but it was full. And one evening, as Jack watched Evelyn read by the window, bathed in the warm light of the setting sun, he realized something. His home didn't feel empty anymore. Of course, no story is without its challenges. Jack often felt a quiet guilt. He still wore his wedding ring. He still kept Sarah's photo on the mantle. And sometimes, the thought would sneak in. Was he betraying her by letting someone new into his life? But Evelyn never asked him to forget. In fact, she asked about Sarah often. She wanted to know who she was, what made Jack smile when he talked about her. And in doing so, she didn't take Sarah's place. She simply took her own beside Jack's memories. That, to me, is the most honest form of companionship, when love expands rather than replaces. One rainy evening, Jack fell ill with a fever. Evelyn noticed he hadn't shown up at the community center and came to check on him. She made tea, sat beside him, called his son, not to alarm him, but to let him know his father had someone who cared. And that night, as Jack lay half awake, listening to Evelyn hum softly from the kitchen, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, safe. If you're still watching, I want you to take a breath and let this truth settle in. It is never too late to matter to someone. Not in a romantic way, Not in a performative way, but in the quiet, essential human way, where someone sees you and chooses to stay. In the comments, if you've ever believed that part of your life was over, but have since found warmth again, even in a small way, right? I opened the door again. Because that's what Jack did. And it didn't erase his past. It just proved his future still had room to grow. Now, their story didn't end there. Life, as always, had more in store, some joyful, some difficult. And soon, Jack would be faced with a new kind of goodbye. But this time, he wouldn't face it alone. Let's walk with him into the next chapter. 5. When goodbye comes without warning, letting go, again. No one tells you that sometimes the second goodbye can hurt even more than the first. Not because it's louder or more final, but because this time, you dared to open your heart again. And now, it's breaking all over in slow motion. For Jack, life had just started to regain its rhythm. After months of quiet, of aching stillness, he had found something steady. Someone steady. Evelyn had become more than just a companion. She was a gentle presence, a warm laugh in the kitchen, a silent understanding at the end of long days. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't need to. Just having each other now was enough. But one afternoon, everything shifted. Evelyn showed up at Jack's doorstep, holding her phone tightly and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can we sit?" she asked softly. Jack nodded, already sensing a weight in her voice he hadn't heard before. They sat at the kitchen table, the one where they'd shared so many casual meals and soft conversations, the one that had come to feel like theirs. Evelyn took a breath, then said it plainly. "My son called. He's getting married. They want me to come live with them." Jack blinked. For a moment, he wasn't sure what emotion to grab first. Happiness for her? Confusion? Fear? "I haven't given him an answer yet," she added quickly. "I told him I'd think about it. But it's a big change." There it was, hanging in the air. A change neither of them had planned for, but one that now sat between them, uninvited and inevitable. Evelyn looked down at her hands, then back at Jack. "I love being here. With you. You know that, right?" Jack nodded, his voice caught somewhere in his chest. "But he's my only child," she continued. "And he's finally settled. They've got space for me. He says it's time we live closer, that we shouldn't waste what's left of the years." Jack wanted to argue, wanted to say, "You've built something here too." But he couldn't, because he understood. Deeply, painfully, he understood the pull of family, the hope of belonging to someone again. "I think you should go," he said after a long pause, his voice even but trembling underneath. "You deserve to be close to your son." Evelyn's eyes welled, and her hand reached for his across the table. "But I'll miss this. I'll miss you." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It wasn't awkward. It was full. Full of everything they didn't need to say. Full of the unspoken truth that sometimes love means letting go, even when it's the last thing you want. That evening, after Evelyn left, Jack stood in the hallway longer than usual. The house felt different, though nothing had changed. He looked around and realized that this place, the one that had once felt empty, then alive again, was starting to echo. Not with loneliness, but with memory. And that was perhaps the hardest part. He wasn't just losing Evelyn's presence. He was losing what she had brought back into his life. Color, rhythm, laughter. He was losing hope, just as he had begun to believe in it again. In my years of working with older adults, I've seen this more times than I can count. Reconnection doesn't guarantee permanence. The people who help us heal often come to us for a season, not a lifetime. But that doesn't make their impact any less sacred. In fact, it makes it more precious. The next few days were quiet. Jack and Evelyn spoke again, several times, trying to pretend it wasn't a goodbye. She packed slowly. He offered to drive her to the station. On the morning of her departure, they sat in the car without speaking for a long time. And then, as the bus pulled away, Jack waved until she was out of sight, and maybe out of reach. He returned home alone. And for a while, the silence felt heavier than ever. Not because he was alone again, but because this time, he had known what it felt like to not be. He moved through the rooms carefully, like walking through a dream. Her teacup still by the sink. Her scarf still hanging near the door. The shadows seemed longer now. The light a little colder. If you've ever had to say goodbye to someone who helped you find yourself again, you'll understand this. It's not the person you miss the most. It's the version of you that came alive when they were near. And that loss, though quiet, is profound. If you're still watching, I'd like you to take a moment. Type, "I remember the light," in the comments if someone once came into your life and made the dark days brighter, even for a short while. Because stories like this aren't just Jack's. They're ours. Jack didn't fall apart after Evelyn left, but he did pause. He did grieve not just her absence, but the rhythm they'd shared. And in that grieving, he came to understand something vital. Just because someone leaves doesn't mean the warmth they brought disappears. It lingers. It shapes you. And eventually, it gives you the strength to begin again. In fact, that strength would be tested sooner than Jack expected. Because just as life had given him the gift of companionship, it was about to remind him how fragile everything truly is. Let's follow him into that next moment. 6. A choice no one talks about. Moving into a nursing home, not out of weakness, but strength. Most people think moving into a nursing home is something that happens to you when you no longer have a say, when your body gives up or your mind slips away. But what if I told you that sometimes it's a choice made not out of weakness, but out of quiet, determined strength? What if stepping into that next chapter was the boldest act of self-respect someone could make? After Evelyn left, the house began to shift again. Not immediately, not drastically, but Jack could feel it. The silence, once comforting in its routine, now carried a different weight. Her absence wasn't just spatial, it was emotional. The spaces they had filled together, however briefly, now seemed to echo more loudly with the memory of companionship. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt something dangerous creeping in, not loneliness, but apathy. The kind that doesn't sting, but dulls. The kind that doesn't cry, but drifts. One afternoon, as he stood in the kitchen pouring himself a cup of coffee, Jack forgot where he'd left the sugar. Not once, but 3 times. He checked the same drawer again and again. Later that night, he missed his evening walk. Not because he was tired, but because, for the first time in months, he didn't care. That scared him more than any ache in his knee ever had. The next morning, Jack did something unexpected. He opened his laptop, pulled up a list of nearby senior living communities, and began to read. Now, let's pause here. Because this isn't something most people talk about, especially not older adults. There's a stigma, even shame, around choosing to live in a nursing home. As if it's an admission of failure. As if it means you've given up. But in my years of working with seniors, I've seen the opposite. I've met men and women who decided before they had to. Who looked at their future not with fear, but with strategy. Who asked themselves not, how long can I hold on? But rather, how do I want the rest of my life to feel? That's exactly what Jack was asking now. He didn't tell his children right away. He needed time to sit with the idea himself. He visited 2 facilities, then 3. He took notes. He asked hard questions. He looked for sunlight, for laughter in the hallways, for kindness in the staff's eyes. And when he found a place that felt right, modest but warm, active but peaceful, he finally picked up the phone. His son Adam was surprised. "Dad, are you sure? Isn't it too soon?" Jack expected the question. In fact, he welcomed it. "It's not about being sick," he told Adam. "It's about being smart. I want community. I want safety. I want a life that moves again, not one that's waiting." Adam was quiet for a long time, then finally said, "If this is what you want, I'll support it." And just like that, a decision was made, not out of panic, but out of purpose. Moving day was strange. Jack looked around his house one last time, the faded family photos, the worn recliner, the bookshelves lined with stories he once lived in. It wasn't sadness he felt. It was reverence. A chapter had ended, and he was turning the page with eyes open, not closed. The first night at the nursing home was quiet, but it was a shared quiet. In the hallway, he passed another resident humming to herself. In the dining room, a man offered him a seat and a card game. Jack smiled, hesitantly, but sincerely. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Jack didn't just adjust. He began to flourish. He joined the walking group. He signed up for trivia night. He started helping in the community garden, even though he hadn't touched soil in years. And with each small step, he felt it again, that long-lost sense of belonging. I want to say this clearly. Independence doesn't always mean living alone. Sometimes, true independence means knowing when to ask for support, when to seek community, when to make a decision before life makes it for you. Jack wasn't surrendering anything. He was reclaiming everything. And in doing so, he discovered something else. Peace. Not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet mornings with shared coffee, in the laughter over lunch, in knowing someone would notice if he didn't show up for bingo. That simple presence, the witnessing of your life, is one of the most powerful things we all need, especially as we age. If you're watching this and have ever thought, "I'll never end up in one of those places," I invite you to reconsider. Not because it's for everyone, but because it might be more you than you realize. Not a last resort, but a next beginning. And if you've already made a choice like Jack's, or are thinking about it, type, "I chose peace," in the comments below. Let someone else see that it's not weakness to choose support. It's wisdom. It's courage. As for Jack, he thought the biggest change was behind him. But life had one more curve ahead. One more twist he didn't see coming. One that would test just how strong his heart had become. Let's walk beside him into that moment. 7. The final blow, when the call comes and the world stops. It's the kind of call that steals the air from your lungs. Not because it's loud or unexpected, but because a voice you know says a sentence you can't bear to hear. For Jack, that moment came on a bright spring afternoon, just when life had finally begun to feel livable again. He was sitting outside at the senior community garden, watering a few herbs he'd come to care for. The breeze was light, the sun gentle. And for a brief moment, Jack had allowed himself something rare: peace. Then his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway. The voice on the other end was Evelyn's son. There was no time for greetings. Just 4 words: "She's been in an accident." Everything slowed down. Jack didn't ask questions at first. He couldn't. He just listened, numb, as her son explained that there had been a car crash. She was hit at an intersection just a few miles from her new home. She was rushed to the hospital. Her condition was critical. "I'm heading there now," her son said. "You should come if you can." The line went dead. Jack stood motionless for several minutes. His body didn't move, but his mind was racing. Every memory of Evelyn flooded in at once. Her laugh, her kindness, the way she touched his arm when she said goodbye, the way she had made the silence in his life feel like music. And now, silence again, but not peaceful. This time it roared. He called for transportation, packed a small bag, and left for the hospital. The drive was a blur. He couldn't tell you what roads they took or what time they arrived. All he remembers is the cold hallway, the antiseptic air, and the red light above the emergency room door blinking like a warning bell no one could silence. Evelyn's son met him there. His face was pale, voice shaking. "They're doing everything they can," he said, but his tone betrayed the hope he couldn't hold. They waited. Minutes stretched into hours. Then a doctor came out, his face unreadable. "She's alive," he said, "but just barely. The injuries are extensive." They let Jack see her briefly. She was unconscious, her face bruised, machines beeping rhythmically around her. Jack took her hand gently, whispering her name. She didn't respond, but he stayed. He stayed through the night, sitting beside her, hoping she could hear him, hoping she knew he was there. The next morning, she opened her eyes, just for a second. Jack leaned in. She didn't speak, but her fingers moved slightly in his. Then a tear rolled down her cheek. And then, as she was still, the monitor beeped once, then flatlined. In that moment, Jack felt something inside him collapse. Not just sadness, but a break. As if a part of him had been pulled out, and the space it left could never be filled. Grief at this age is different. It's not loud. It doesn't scream. It settles quietly into your bones. It shows up in your breathing, in the way you pause before answering a question, in the way you stare at the empty chair beside you. Back at the nursing home, Jack returned to his routine, but everything felt hollow. He showed up to meals, but barely ate. He joined walks, but didn't talk. Staff noticed. So did residents. But no one knew how to comfort someone who had already lost so much. And now, someone again. As someone who's worked with hundreds of seniors facing repeated loss, I've seen how dangerous this kind of grief can be. It doesn't just take your joy. It steals your will. If left untouched, it grows into isolation that's nearly impossible to climb out of. But Jack didn't disappear. Because deep inside, Evelyn had left him with something more than memories. She had reminded him what it meant to be seen, to be cared for. And even in death, that gift remained. So he began, slowly, to let that gift guide him forward. He returned to the garden. He volunteered to read to residents in memory care. He began helping newcomers settle into the home. Not because he was done grieving, but because grief had taught him something. Life is fragile, yes, but it is also resilient. And Evelyn, she may have left, but she didn't take everything. She left Jack with the tools to rebuild. If you've ever lost someone late in life, you know this truth. The pain doesn't shrink. You simply grow around it. You become someone who can carry it, gently, alongside your joy. If you're still watching, Type, "I carry the love," in the comments below if someone once brought light to your life. And even after they left, you still carry their warmth inside you. That's not weakness. That's the proof that love never really dies. It just changes shape. Jack would carry Evelyn with him always. In the garden soil, in the evening light, in the pauses between conversation, when her laughter used to live. And though the pain of losing her would never fully leave, something new was starting to form, an understanding, a quiet wisdom. Because what came next in Jack's journey wasn't just about healing. It was about passing it on. And that's exactly where we'll go next. 8. Becoming whole again, the quiet strength that grows in grief. People often think that growth ends with age, that once we retire, slow down, or lose someone we love, we simply are who we are. But nothing could be further from the truth. Because sometimes, the most profound growth doesn't come in our youth or our prime. It comes after we've lost something we thought we couldn't live without. It comes in silence, in grief, and in the gentle rebuilding that follows. For Jack, this stage didn't announce itself. There were no trumpets, no breakthroughs. Just quiet mornings where the air felt a little heavier. Evenings where the sunset seemed more like a memory than a promise. After Evelyn's death, something in him shifted, not just from sadness, but from awareness. It wasn't the pain that surprised him. It was what came after. He started noticing things differently. The weight of someone's touch in a handshake. The way another resident's eyes lit up when someone remembered their name. The meaning behind small gestures, like the nurse who always refilled his tea without asking, or the way birds gathered by his window, as if keeping him company. At first, these details felt fragile, like they might break under the weight of his sorrow. But slowly, they became anchors, tiny threads that tied him back to the world. And with each thread, Jack began to stitch together something deeper than recovery. He was building a new kind of wholeness. There's a concept in Japanese philosophy called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, they fill them with precious metal, highlighting the break as part of the story. Stronger, more beautiful, more valuable. That's what Jack was becoming. He wasn't moving on. He wasn't letting go. Those phrases had never sat right with him anyway. He was integrating everything he had lived, everything he had lost, everything he still hoped for. He was growing, not in spite of his pain, but because of it. He began writing again, not memoirs or letters, but short reflections. Observations about life in the nursing home, about people, about love that arrives late and leaves early. He shared a few with the activity director, who asked if he'd consider reading them aloud during community events. Jack hesitated at first, but eventually he said yes. And so, one afternoon, surrounded by other residents, some alert, some dozing, some wheeled in by quiet staff, Jack read. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't read dramatically, but he spoke with clarity, with stillness. And when he finished, the room was silent, not because no one had heard him, but because everyone had. After that, people started talking to him differently, sharing more, asking more. Jack became, without meaning to, a kind of quiet lighthouse, someone who had walked through fog and stood tall enough to be seen. He never sought attention. He didn't try to lead. But leadership has many forms. And sometimes, the most powerful kind comes from someone who's simply still here, after everything. Still standing, still soft, still open. As someone who's worked with older adults for years, I've seen this phase in many forms. Some find it in prayer, others in art, or gardening, or letters to their grandchildren. But the pattern is the same. After the storm comes a strange, golden stillness. Not numbness, but clarity. A gentle confidence. A deep sense that life doesn't need to be loud to be meaningful. One afternoon, as Jack sat in the garden with a new resident named Harold, a quiet man who had just lost his wife, he noticed something familiar in Harold's silence. It wasn't just grief. It was fear. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of starting over. Fear of trying. Jack didn't say much. Just offered him a cup of tea and sat beside him for a while. And that's when he realized his healing wasn't just his own. It was relational. Because when we grow stronger, we don't just rise for ourselves. We become safe space for others to lean on. If you've ever gone through something that broke you, truly shattered you, and still managed to wake up, eat, smile, breathe, then you know this truth. You are not the same person anymore. And that's not a bad thing. That's transformation. If you're still watching, I'd like you to type, "I've grown through this" in the comments. Not because you have all the answers, but because you felt the shift. And that deserves recognition. Jack's journey didn't have a perfect resolution. Life doesn't tie itself in neat bows. But what he discovered was this: strength isn't the absence of pain. It's the quiet willingness to carry it and still be kind, still be curious, still love again in whatever way life allows. The final chapter of his story wasn't about grand achievements. It was about presence, about walking into each day with awareness, with gratitude, and with a heart open enough to receive the unexpected. Because sometimes, even in our final season, something beautiful can still find us. Let's meet Jack there. If you've made it to this moment, let me say this first. Thank you. Not just for watching, but for staying, for sitting with these stories, for walking beside Jack, not just as a viewer, but as someone willing to feel again, and perhaps even begin again. What you've just witnessed isn't just one man's journey. It's a reflection of something much deeper, something many of us quietly carry but rarely name out loud: the fear of being forgotten, the ache of losing meaning, the question that lingers in the quiet corners of our later years: am I still someone to someone? Through Jack's life, we saw what it means to lose and love again, to open your heart, only to have it broken once more, and then, somehow, to still choose hope. That is not weakness. That is not sentimentality. That is resilience in its purest form. We saw what it means to grow after grief, not by erasing it, but by weaving it into who we become. Jack didn't move on from his wife. He carried her in memory. He didn't forget Evelyn. He lived what she taught him. And through that, he discovered the quiet strength that only comes when you've faced the silence and answered it with life. I've worked with countless older adults in the past 10 years, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, your later years are not the end of your story. They're a new chapter, written with the wisdom of everything you've lived, the softness born from pain, and the clarity that comes when you've been forced to sit with yourself. You are not disappearing. You are refining. And what makes this chapter even more powerful is this: you get to choose what you carry forward. Will it be bitterness? Isolation? Or will it be grace? Gratitude? The willingness to still reach for someone's hand, even if it shakes a little now? That's what Jack chose. Not perfection, not comfort, but presence. He chose to live not as someone waiting for the end, but as someone who still had stories to tell, kindness to give, and love to feel, even in quiet, simple ways. So now, I turn this moment back to you. If Jack's journey reminded you of someone in your life, or even of your own heart, I want to ask you, gently but sincerely, to take a moment and reflect. What stage are you in? Are you still holding on to pain without giving it space to breathe? Are you sitting in silence that feels more like sorrow than peace? Or maybe, just maybe, are you starting to hear the whisper that says, "There's still more for me"? Because if you are, I want to invite you to do something bold. Not loud, not public, just real. Write a comment below and finish this sentence: what I'm still learning is. There's no right or wrong answer. Maybe you're learning to be gentle with yourself. Maybe you're learning how to forgive, or how to speak up, or how to let go. Whatever it is, I promise it matters. And it might just be the thing someone else needed to read today. And if you feel a little braver, type, "I'm still here." Because sometimes, those 3 words say more than an entire biography. Now, if this video touched you in any way, if it made you think, cry, breathe deeper, or remember something you thought you forgot, please consider clicking the like button. It may seem small, but it helps more people find this message. People who may be sitting alone right now, waiting for something, anything, to remind them that they still matter. And if you'd like to walk this journey with us again, I'd be honored if you subscribe to this channel. We're building a community here. Not one built on youth or trends, but on depth, on honesty, on growing old with grace, truth, and dignity. Together. And yes, share this video with a friend, a sibling, a parent, or someone who may not say they're lonely, but who hasn't been seen in a while. Sometimes, a shared story can be the spark that reopens a closed heart. Before we close, I want to leave you with this. Your life has not passed you by. You are not too old to begin something beautiful. You are not too broken to be whole again. And you are not invisible, at least not here. Because here, we honor the quiet stories, the late chapters, the tender strength that only time can teach. So thank you, again, for choosing to stay, for choosing to feel, and for choosing to keep going. You've made it this far, and I promise, the road ahead, however uncertain, still has room for grace. Let's keep walking together.